The Battle of Manzikert stands as the most devastating catastrophe in Byzantine history. Byzantines themselves held no illusions about its magnitude. Their historians repeatedly mentioned that dreadful day. For later crusaders, it appeared that the Byzantines had lost their claim as defenders of Christendom on that battlefield. Manzikert served as a justification for Western intervention. Despite their victory, the Turks did not immediately capitalize on it. Alp Arslan had achieved his primary goals, securing his flank and neutralizing the threat of a Byzantine Fatimid alliance. His terms for the captured emperor were limited to the withdrawal from Armenia and a substantial ransom for his release. Afterward, he proceeded to campaign in Transoxiana, where he died in 1072. His son and successor, Malik Shah, never personally campaigned in Asia Minor. However, his Turkoman followers began to move. Rather than settle them in the long-established territories of the Caliphate, he directed them towards the central plains of Anatolia, which the Byzantine nobility had already emptied and converted into vast sheep pastures. Malik Shah entrusted his cousin, Suleiman ibn Kutalmish, with the mission of conquering the region for the Turks. The Byzantines themselves facilitated the conquest. The following 2 decades were marked by internal strife and conspiracies. When news of the defeat and the emperor's capture reached Constantinople, his stepson Michael Ducas declared himself of age and assumed control. His authority was solidified by the arrival of his cousin Andronicus with what remained of the army. Michael VII, though intelligent and cultured, was ill-equipped to address the enormous challenges of his time. Romanus Diogenes, upon returning from captivity, found himself deposed. Attempting to reclaim his throne, he was quickly defeated, captured, and brought to Constantinople. There, his eyes were gouged out with such brutality that he died shortly after. Though Michael could not risk allowing Romanus to live, the cruelty of his fate shocked Romanus's influential relatives and his supporters, who soon turned their anger into betrayal. In 1073, Turkish incursions into Asia Minor began in earnest. These invasions were uncoordinated and varied in nature. Suleiman aspired to establish a stable sultanate under the overlordship of Malik Shah. However, other Turkish leaders like Danishmend, Shaka, and Mingachek sought to seize towns or fortresses to rule as bandit chieftains over the local populations. Driving the invasion forward were the Turkoman nomads moving toward the Anatolian highlands. Christians fled ahead of them, abandoning their homes, which were burned, and their livestock, which were seized. Although the Turkomans generally avoided the cities, their disruptive presence severed communication lines across the region, isolated provincial governors, and allowed Turkish warlords to pursue their own ambitions. Their widespread presence would ultimately prevent any meaningful Byzantine reconquest. Emperor Michael attempted to resist the Turkish advance. The cautious betrayal of Roussel of Balliol had allowed his Franco-Norman regiment to survive the catastrophe at Manzikert. Though Roussel had already proven to be unreliable, Michael had little choice but to employ him. He assigned to Roussel a small native force led by the young Isaac Comnenus, nephew of the former emperor. Choosing Isaac was a wise decision. Isaac and his brother Alexius, who accompanied him, belonged to a family that deeply resented the Ducas dynasty. Nevertheless, despite their mother's urgings, both brothers remained loyal to Michael throughout his reign and proved themselves as capable generals. However, Isaac's loyalty was undone by Roussel's treachery. Before their combined army had even encountered the Turks, Roussel and his men rebelled. Surrounded and heavily outnumbered by both Turkish and Frankish forces, Isaac was captured by the Seljuks. Roussel then revealed his true ambitions. Inspired by his fellow Normans who had established their own state in southern Italy, he aimed to found a Norman principality in Anatolia. Though his force consisted of only 3,000 men, they were fiercely loyal, well-trained, and well-armed. To Emperor Michael, Roussel now appeared a greater threat than the Turks themselves. Gathering whatever troops he could muster, Michael dispatched them under his uncle, Caesar John Ducas. Near Amorium, Roussel easily defeated them, capturing the Caesar in the process. Seeking to legitimize his actions, Roussel proclaimed the captive Caesar as emperor and marched towards Constantinople. Reaching the Asian side of the Bosphorus unopposed, Roussel burned the suburb of Chrysopolis, modern Scutari, and established camp among its ruins. In desperation, Michael turned to the only force that could assist him, the Seljuk Sultan Suleiman. With the consent of his overlord, Malik Shah, Suleiman agreed to help in exchange for the eastern Anatolian provinces he already controlled. Roussel turned back to confront the Seljuk army, but his forces were encircled by the Turks at Mount Sapon in Cappadocia. He managed to escape with a small group of followers and established himself in Amasya, further to the northeast. Michael then dispatched Alexius Comnenus to deal with the situation. Alexius succeeded in winning over the chief local Turkish leader, who persuaded Roussel to surrender. Roussel's rule had been so effective and popular that the citizens of Amasya only abandoned their rescue efforts upon hearing that he had been blinded. In reality, Alexius could not bring himself to inflict such harm, and his personal charm even pleased the emperor, who was relieved to learn that Roussel had been spared that fate. Roussel disappears from the historical record, but the consequences of his actions lingered for the Byzantines. They learned a harsh lesson. The Normans could not be trusted. Their ambitions extended far beyond the shores of southern Italy. They sought to carve out new principalities in the east. This experience heavily influenced Byzantine policy 2 decades later. In the interim, Normans were discouraged from serving in the imperial forces, and even their Scandinavian relatives were viewed with suspicion. From that point on, the Varangian Guard was primarily recruited from the Anglo-Saxons of Britain, who themselves had suffered at the hands of the Normans. The growing Norman threat and the empire's ongoing reliance on foreign mercenaries pushed Michael to adopt a policy of appeasement toward the west. Southern Italy was irretrievably lost, and the empire lacked the resources to continue the conflict there. Michael sent John Italus, an Italian-born philosopher, as his envoy to negotiate peace with the Normans. Many Byzantines saw this as a betrayal of imperial interests, but Michael was content. Recognizing the ambitions of the rising house of Hauteville to forge prestigious marital ties, he proposed a union between Guiscard's daughter, Helen, and his infant son, Constantine. Simultaneously, he secured the favor of Pope Gregory VII, establishing a friendly relationship with the papacy. This diplomacy ensured peace along the western frontier. Meanwhile, disorder in Anatolia continued to escalate. The imperial administration steadily lost control. Although a few loyal generals, such as Alexius Comnenus, who now commanded Antioch, maintained allegiance to the emperor, disrupted communications, and the absence of coherent policy deepened the crisis. In 1078, Nicephorus Batiniates, governor of the large Anatolic theme in West-Central Asia Minor, driven by both personal ambition and frustration with Michael's feeble rule, rose in rebellion. Lacking his own army, he recruited large numbers of Turks, placing them as garrisons in the cities he captured on his march to the capital. For the first time, Turkish forces entered the major cities of Western Anatolia. Though they served as mercenaries under the new emperor, dislodging them would prove difficult. Michael offered no resistance. Upon Batiniates' arrival in Constantinople, he retired peacefully to a monastery, where he discovered his true calling. Unlike many deposed emperors, he rose swiftly through church ranks and eventually became an archbishop. His abandoned wife, Maria of Alania, a renowned beauty from the Caucasus, wisely chose to marry the usurper. However, ruling proved more challenging for Nicephorus than rebelling. Other generals soon followed his example. In the Western Balkans, Nicephorus Bryennius, governor of Dyrrhachium, proclaimed himself emperor and rallied troops from the European provinces. Alexius Comnenus was dispatched with a modest force of inexperienced Greek soldiers and a few unreliable Franks, who soon deserted him. Only with the timely arrival of Turkish mercenaries was Alexius able to defeat Bryennius. No sooner was this threat subdued than Alexius was forced to march to Thessaly to suppress another uprising led by Basilacius. Simultaneously, the Turkish garrison in Nicaea revolted. Pope Gregory, angered by Michael's fall, excommunicated the new emperor. Robert Guiscard, encouraged by the papacy and enraged over the broken engagement of his daughter, prepared for war. In May, he landed at Avlona with a full army and advanced on Dyrrhachium. That spring, another key general in Asia, Nicephorus Melissenus, also rebelled and forged an alliance with the Turkish Sultan Suleiman. This pact allowed Suleiman to march into Bithynia unopposed, where the Turkish garrisons left behind by Batiniates welcomed him. When Melissenus failed to capture Constantinople, Suleiman refused to relinquish the cities under his control. Instead, he firmly established himself in Nicaea. Thus, Nicaea became the capital of the Turkish Sultanate. In Constantinople, Emperor Nicephorus squandered his only chance of survival by alienating the Comnenus family. Isaac and Alexius had faithfully served him, hoping to maintain his favor through close ties with the empress. However, the empress was powerless to prevent the court intrigues that turned Nicephorus against them. To protect themselves, the brothers were compelled to rebel, and Alexius, recognized by his family as the more capable of the two, declared himself emperor. Nicephorus was deposed with as little resistance as the ruler he had previously overthrown. On the advice of the patriarch, he retired in defeat and humiliation to spend the rest of his life as a monk. Alexius Comnenus would go on to rule for 37 years and become one of the greatest statesmen of his era. Yet, in 1081, it appeared unlikely that either he or the empire would survive. Though likely not yet 30 years old, Alexius already had extensive military experience, often commanding inadequate forces and relying on his cunning and diplomacy to succeed. He made a strong impression. His manners were gracious and approachable, and his remarkable self-control was paired with both genuine kindness and a shrewd willingness to use deception or force when necessary for the good of the state. His only real resources were his personal talents and the loyalty of his soldiers. His family connections within the Byzantine aristocracy had certainly aided his rise, and he further solidified his position by marrying into the Ducas family. However, the ambitions and rivalries within his own family, particularly his mother's deep hostility toward his wife and her relatives, only compounded his difficulties. The court was filled with members of former imperial dynasties and potential usurpers, whom Alexius tried to secure through marriage alliances. There was the Empress Maria, fiercely jealous of his wife, Irene, and Maria's son, Constantine Ducas, whom Alexius made his junior co-emperor and engaged to his eldest daughter, Anna. Romanus Diogenes' sons were also present, one of whom married Alexius' sister Theodora. After Constantine Ducas' early death, Anna Comnena married the son of Nicephorus Bryennius. Nicephorus Melissenus, already married to Alexius' sister Eudocia, surrendered his imperial claims in exchange for the title of Caesar. Alexius had to carefully manage all these relationships, quelling disputes and preempting betrayals. A complex hierarchy of titles was established to satisfy their ambitions. The nobility and high-ranking officials were equally untrustworthy. Alexius repeatedly uncovered conspiracies against him and constantly faced the threat of assassination. Yet, both by nature and political strategy, he remained lenient in his punishments. His clemency, along with his far-sighted and measured approach to governance, is all the more remarkable given the persistent personal danger that surrounded him throughout his reign. The condition of the empire in 1081 was such that only a man of exceptional courage or sheer recklessness would have dared to assume its leadership. The treasury was empty. Recent emperors had squandered funds, while the loss of Anatolia and continuous uprisings in Europe had severely reduced state revenues. The traditional system of tax collection had completely collapsed. Alexius was no expert in finance. His methods would shock any modern economist. Nevertheless, through heavy taxation that pushed his subjects to their limits, the imposition of forced loans, the confiscation of wealth from the nobility and the church, fines replacing imprisonment, the sale of privileges, and the expansion of palace-run industries, he somehow managed to fund a large bureaucracy, rebuild the military and naval forces, maintain a splendid court, and shower gifts upon loyal subjects and visiting dignitaries. He understood that, in the East, power depended heavily on displays of wealth and grandeur. Parsimony was the one unforgivable offense. However, Alexius committed two major blunders. In exchange for immediate assistance, he granted foreign merchants commercial privileges that harmed his own people. At a critical point, he also debased the imperial currency. The situation in foreign affairs was even graver. If one could still meaningfully distinguish between internal and external threats, for enemies had penetrated deeply into every part of the empire. In Europe, Alexius retained only a fragile hold over the Balkan Peninsula. The Slavs of Serbia and Dalmatia had risen in revolt, while the Pecheneg Turks, wandering beyond the Danube, repeatedly crossed the river to raid imperial lands. To the west, Robert Guiscard and the Normans had seized Avlona and were laying siege to Dyrrhachium. In Asia, little remained under Byzantine control beyond the Black Sea coastline, a few scattered cities along the southern coast, and the heavily fortified stronghold of Antioch. Communication with these distant outposts was infrequent and unreliable. A few inland cities remained in Christian hands, but their rulers were completely cut off from Constantinople. Most of Anatolia had fallen under the authority of the Seljuk Sultan Suleiman, who ruled from Nicaea over a vast but loosely governed domain stretching from the Bosphorus to the Syrian frontier. His realm lacked a structured administration and had no stable borders. Other regions were controlled by lesser Turkish warlords, some recognizing Suleiman's authority, though most owed allegiance directly to Malik Shah. Among the most notable were the Danishmend family, who controlled Caesarea, Sebastia, and Amasya. Mengachek, who ruled Erzincan and Colonia, and the most dangerous of all, the ambitious adventurer Shaka, who had captured Smyrna and the Aegean coastline. While some semblance of order was maintained in these rulers' urban centers, the countryside remained chaotic, overrun by nomadic Turkoman bands. The confusion was worsened by the movement of Greek and Armenian refugees. Many Christians converted to Islam and were gradually assimilated into the Turkish population. A handful of Greek communities survived in isolated mountain areas, while the Christian Turks, settled centuries earlier around Caesarea in Cappadocia, managed to preserve their distinct identity and faith into modern times. However, most of the Greek population sought refuge along the shores of the Black Sea and the Aegean. The migration of the Armenians was carried out in a more deliberate and organized fashion. The Armenian princes who had been displaced by the Byzantines were granted estates in Cappadocia, particularly in the southern regions near the Taurus Mountains. Many of their followers accompanied them, and, as the Seljuk invasions intensified, a steady flow of Armenians left their ancestral lands to join these newly established settlements. Eventually, nearly half of Armenia's population was moving southwest. The continued Turkish advance into Cappadocia forced them even further into the Taurus and anti-Taurus mountain ranges, and they eventually expanded into the valley of the Middle Euphrates, which remained untouched by Turkish forces at that time. The territories they abandoned were soon occupied, not by Turks, but by Muslim Kurds migrating from the highlands of Assyria and northwestern Iran. The last Armenian prince of the ancient Bagratid dynasty was executed on Byzantine orders in 1079, after he had committed the particularly brutal murder of the Archbishop of Caesarea. In response, one of his relatives, Rupen, rebelled against the empire and established himself in the hills of northwestern Cilicia. Around the same time, another Armenian leader, Ashin, the son of Hethum, founded a similar principality slightly to the west. Both the Rupenian and Hathumian dynasties would later play significant roles in history, though at that moment they were overshadowed by the more prominent Armenian figure, Varum, known to the Greeks as Philaretus. Philaretus had previously served in the Byzantine army and had been appointed governor of Germanicia, Marash, by Emperor Romanus Diogenes. After Romanus' downfall, Philaretus refused to recognize the rule of Michael Ducas and declared his independence. Amid the chaos of Michael's reign, he captured several key Cilician cities. In 1077, One of his commanders seized Edessa from the Byzantines after a 6-month siege. The following year, the people of Antioch, whose governor had just been assassinated, pleaded with Philaretus to assume control of the city to protect it from Turkish invasion. His domain now extended from Tarsus across the Euphrates, with both Rupin and Ashan becoming his vassals. Yet Philaretus remained uneasy. Unlike most of his contemporaries, he adhered to the Orthodox faith and was reluctant to completely sever ties with the empire. Upon Michael's abdication, he declared his loyalty to Nicephorus Batiniates, who allowed him to govern the lands he had taken. Philaretus appears to have acknowledged Alexius as well, while also prudently offering a form of tribute to the Arab rulers of Aleppo as a safeguard. Upon ascending to the throne, Alexius was immediately faced with the decision of which enemy to confront first. Judging that the Turks could only be expelled through a prolonged and sustained campaign for which he was not yet prepared, he deemed it more pressing to repel the Norman invasion. However, the task proved more prolonged than he had anticipated. In the summer of 1081, Robert Guiscard, accompanied by his formidable wife, Sigilgaita of Salerno, and his eldest son, Bohemond, began the siege of Dyrrhachium. That October, Alexius led an army, whose core consisted of the Anglo-Saxon Varangian Guard, to relieve the city. But, as had happened to Hastings 15 years earlier, the Anglo-Saxons could not match the strength of the Normans. Alexius suffered a crushing defeat. Though Dyrrhachium managed to hold out through the winter, it eventually capitulated in February 1082, allowing Robert to advance in the spring along the Via Egnatia toward Constantinople. Soon after, developments in Italy forced Robert to return home, leaving Bohemond in charge of securing Macedonia and Greece. Bohemond twice defeated Alexius, who was then compelled to seek assistance, troops from the Turks and naval support from the Venetians. While the Venetians disrupted Norman supply lines, the Turkish forces helped Alexius reclaim Thessaly. In 1083, Bohemond withdrew to Italy but returned with his father the following year, successfully defeating the Venetian fleet near Corfu. The conflict finally came to an end with Robert's death on Cephalonia in 1085, which led to disputes between his sons over their inheritance. At last, imperial control was reasserted over the European provinces, but during those 4 years, the eastern provinces were irretrievably lost. Philaretus became dangerously entangled in Turkish politics. In early 1085, his son betrayed Antioch to Sultan Suleiman, surrendering the city along with his Cilician territories. Edessa was taken by the Turkish leader Buzan in 1087, but was later reclaimed in 1094 by Thuras, an Armenian who had formerly served as a vassal of Malik Shah and was initially kept in check by a Turkish garrison stationed in the citadel. Meanwhile, Melitene was seized by Gabriel, Thuras's father-in-law, another Armenian who, like Thuras, belonged to the Orthodox Church. Tensions between the Orthodox, Jacobite, and Armenian churches further aggravated instability throughout northern Syria. The non-Orthodox communities welcomed the decline of Byzantine power, often preferring Turkish rule over Byzantine authority. In southern Syria, Seljuk control was now firmly established. Ever since Tughril Bey's entry into Baghdad in 1055, Fatimid possession of Syria had been under threat, leading to a climate of anxiety, unrest, and minor revolts. In 1056, when Byzantine frontier officials at Lataki prevented the pilgrim bishop of Cambrai from traveling south, the Westerners suspected simple hostility toward a Latin cleric. However, the Byzantines were genuinely concerned about the safety of travelers in Syria. This caution was later validated when, 8 years afterward, German bishops crossed the frontier against advice and suffered the consequences, confirming the legitimacy of Byzantine warnings. In 1071, the year that witnessed both the Battle of Manzikert and the fall of Bari, a Turkish adventurer named Atsiz Ibn Abak, nominally a vassal of Alp Arslan, seized Jerusalem without resistance and quickly extended his control over all of Palestine down to the frontier fortress of Ascalon. In 1075, he occupied Damascus and took control of its surrounding region. The following year, the Fatimids briefly recaptured Jerusalem, but Atsiz reclaimed it after several months of siege, during which he massacred much of the Muslim population while sparing the Christians, who found refuge within their walled quarter. Despite this brutal episode, the Fatimids soon launched an assault on Damascus, forcing Atsiz to seek assistance from the Seljuk prince Tutush, brother of Malik Shah, who was building his own sultanate in Syria with his brother's blessing. In 1079, Tutush had Atsiz murdered and established himself as the sole ruler over a domain that stretched from Aleppo to the Egyptian frontier. Tutush and his deputy Ortok, the governor of Jerusalem, seem to have maintained a relatively stable government. Christians were not specifically targeted, though the Orthodox Patriarch of Jerusalem spent much of his time in Constantinople, while his counterpart from Antioch relocated there permanently. By 1085, with the Norman threat neutralized, Emperor Alexius turned his attention to the Turks. Up to this point, he had relied on continuous political maneuvering, pitting Turkish leaders against one another to keep their power in check. Now, combining diplomacy with military displays, he negotiated a treaty that returned Nicomedia and the Anatolian shores of the Sea of Marmara to the empire. His patience yielded even greater results the following year when Suleiman ibn Kutalmish, after capturing Antioch, advanced on Aleppo. The Arab ruler of Aleppo called upon Tutush for aid, and in the ensuing battle outside the city, Tutush defeated Suleiman, who was killed. Suleiman's death plunged the Turks of Anatolia into disarray, providing Alexius with ample opportunity to manipulate rival chieftains, exploiting their jealousies with offers of bribes and possible marriage alliances. For 6 years, Nicaea remained under the control of the rebel Turkish leader Abu el-Qasim, until Malik Shah succeeded in replacing him in 1092 with Suleiman's son, Kilij Arslan I. In the meantime, Alexius worked to secure his position, though progress was slow. His only real territorial gain was the town of Cyzicus, while he failed to stop the Danishmends from expanding westward and seizing his family's ancestral estate at Kastamuni in Paphlagonia. Internal palace intrigues also posed a constant challenge, and in 1087 he faced a significant invasion from across the Danube, led by the Pechenegs with support from Hungary. It was not until 1091 that his diplomatic skills, combined with a decisive military victory, finally eliminated the barbarian threat from the north. Even more concerning was Shaka, the Turkish emir of Smyrna. Ambitious beyond his peers, Shaka aspired to become emperor himself. Understanding the importance of naval power, he employed Greek sailors rather than Turks and sought to unite the Turkish princes under his leadership. He even strengthened his position by marrying his daughter to the young Kilij Arslan. Between 1080 and 1090, Shaka seized control of the Aegean coast along with the islands of Lesbos, Chios, Samos, and Rhodes. One of Alexius's first priorities had been to rebuild the Byzantine fleet, and eventually he succeeded in defeating Shaka at sea near the entrance of the Marmara. Nevertheless, the threat persisted until 1092, when Shaka was assassinated at a banquet in Nicaea by his son-in-law, Kilij Arslan, acting on the emperor's advice. Fearing Shaka's growing power, Kilij Arslan removed him before he could become too great a rival. With the deaths of Suleiman and Shaka, Alexius was able to consider a more assertive policy. His position in Constantinople was now secure, the European provinces were stable, his navy was functioning effectively, and his treasury enjoyed a temporary surplus. However, his army remained small. With Anatolia lost, he had few native troops available, making him heavily reliant on trained foreign mercenaries. By around 1095, the power of the Seljuks appeared to be waning. Malik Shah, who had managed to maintain some degree of unity across the vast Turkish Empire, died in 1092. His passing sparked a civil war among his young sons. For nearly a decade, the Turkish focus shifted primarily to this internal struggle as they negotiated over the division of their inheritance. Meanwhile, Arab and Kurdish leaders rose to prominence in Iraq. In Syria, following Tutush's death in 1095, his sons, Ridwan in Aleppo and Dukak in Damascus, proved unable to maintain order. Jerusalem came under the control of Orthodox sons, whose rule was ineffective and oppressive. The Orthodox Patriarch Simeon, along with his senior clergy, withdrew to Cyprus. In Tripoli, a Shiite faction known as the Banu Ammar established an independent principality. The Fatimids began reclaiming southern Palestine. Meanwhile, in the north, Kerboga, the Atabeg of Mosul under the Abbasid Caliph, gradually extended his influence into Ridwan's territories around Aleppo. To travelers of that era, it seemed that each city was ruled by a different master. Remarkably, despite these conditions, travelers continued to make the journey. Though pilgrimages never entirely ceased, the routes had grown increasingly dangerous. In Jerusalem, until the death of Ortok, the Christian community's daily life was relatively undisturbed, and unless open conflict broke out between the Turks and Egyptians, Palestine often remained calm. Anatolia, however, had become treacherous to cross without an armed escort, and even then, danger lurked along the way, with wars or hostile authorities frequently blocking passage. Syria offered little improvement. Bandits infested the roads, and local rulers at each town imposed heavy tolls on travelers. Those pilgrims who managed to complete the arduous journey returned home exhausted, impoverished, and full of horrifying stories. The Christian faces a fundamental dilemma. Does his faith permit him to fight for his country? Christianity is a religion rooted in peace, while war brings about killing and devastation. The early church fathers had no hesitation in their view. However, after Christianity triumphed and the empire itself became Christendom, the question arose whether its citizens should be willing to take up arms to protect it. The Eastern Church believed otherwise. Its prominent canonist, Saint Basil, acknowledged that soldiers were bound to obey their orders, yet insisted that anyone who killed in battle should abstain from communion for 3 years as a sign of repentance. This standard proved too severe in practice. Byzantine soldiers were not treated as murderers, but their role brought little honor. Death in battle was not seen as glorious, nor was dying while fighting non-Christians considered martyrdom. True martyrs died armed only with faith. Fighting the infidel was regrettable, though sometimes unavoidable, while engaging in war against fellow Christians was viewed as even more reprehensible. In fact, Byzantine history shows a notable absence of wars driven by aggression. Justinian's campaigns aimed to liberate Romans from heretical barbarian rulers, and Basil II's wars against the Bulgars sought to reclaim imperial provinces and eliminate threats to Constantinople. Diplomatic solutions, even if complex or costly, were always preferred. To Western historians who admire military valor, many Byzantine leaders might seem cowardly or cunning, but their primary motivation was often a sincere desire to avoid bloodshed. Anna Comnena, one of the most representative Byzantines, illustrates in her writings that, though deeply interested in military affairs and proud of her father's victories, she regarded war as shameful, a last resort, signifying failure when all other measures had failed. In contrast, the Western perspective was less restrained. Saint Augustine acknowledged that wars could be fought by divine command, and the militaristic culture that evolved in the West after the barbarian invasions naturally sought to legitimize its violent tendencies. The emerging chivalric code, supported by popular epics, glorified the military hero, while pacifists earned a lasting reputation for cowardice. The Church could do little to counter this mindset. Instead, it sought to channel martial zeal in ways that serve its interests. Thus, the concept of holy war became acceptable, even commendable. In the mid-9th century, Pope Leo IV proclaimed that those who died defending the Church would be rewarded in heaven. A few years later, Pope John VIII declared that those who perished in holy wars would be regarded as martyrs, their sins forgiven if they died in battle. However, these soldiers were expected to maintain purity of heart. Nicholas I decreed that men under church censure for their sins should not bear arms, except when fighting non-believers. Although the highest church authorities did not outright forbid warfare, there were Western thinkers who found it deeply disturbing. Bruno of Erfurt, a German martyred by pagan Prussians in 1009, was appalled by the wars waged by the emperors of his era against fellow Christians. A movement advocating peace had already begun in France. At the Council of Charroux in 989, where the bishops of Aquitaine gathered to defend clerical immunity, the idea emerged that the church should ensure that the poor could live in safety. The following year, at the Council of Le Puy, this proposal was reiterated with greater resolve. Guy of Anjou, Bishop of Le Puy, emphasized that without peace, no one could see the Lord, and therefore urged everyone to become children of peace. A few years later, William the Great, Duke of Guienne, advanced the concept further. At the Council of Poitiers in 1000, it was decreed that disputes should be settled through legal means rather than by violence, and that those who defied this decree would face excommunication. The Duke and his nobles formally agreed to these terms, and Robert the Pious, King of France, established a similar rule within his own realm. While the Church's primary concern remained the protection of its lands and properties from the devastation of war, numerous councils were convened to reinforce this objective. At Verdun-sur-le-Doubs in 1016, a formula was established by which nobles swore not to conscript clergy or peasants into their armies, not to raid crops, and not to seize livestock. This oath was widely taken throughout France, accompanied by the resounding chant of priests and congregants, "Peace, peace, peace." Emboldened by this success, some zealous bishops sought to take more drastic steps. In 1038, Aymon, Archbishop of Bourges, commanded that every Christian over the age of 15 declare themselves an enemy of those who broke the peace and be prepared to fight against them if necessary. Leagues of peace were formed and initially proved effective. However, the second part of the archbishop's directive became far more appealing than the first. Armed bands of peasants, led by clergy, attacked and destroyed castles of defiant nobles. But these militias soon turned reckless and destructive, forcing the authorities to intervene and disband them. After a major league of peace set fire to the village of Benicy, Count Odo of Dales confronted and defeated them on the banks of the Cher River. Reports claim that no fewer than 700 clerics died in the battle. At the same time, a more pragmatic effort was underway to restrict the practice of warfare. In 1027, Alaba, Bishop of Vich, convened a synod at Toulouse in Roussillon, where it was decreed that fighting should cease during the hours of the Sabbath. This concept of suspending hostilities on sacred days was soon expanded. Influenced by the great abbot of Cluny, Odilo, the bishops of Provence, speaking on behalf of the entire Church of Gaul, addressed a letter in 1041 to the Church in Italy, proposing that the Truce of God be extended to include Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and Ascension Day. The Church of Aquitaine had already adopted similar measures. Burgundy went even further, instituting a truce that covered the period from Wednesday evening to Monday morning each week, as well as the entire time from Advent until the first Sunday after Epiphany, and from Lent through Holy Week to the octave of Easter. In 1042, William the Conqueror, legislating for Normandy, expanded the truce to include the days from the Rogation period until the octave of Pentecost. By 1050, a council at Toulouse recommended adding the 3 feast days dedicated to the Virgin Mary and the major saints' days. By the middle of the 11th century, the concept of the Truce of God had become widely accepted. The Great Council of Narbonne in 1054 sought to integrate it with the peace of God, which aimed to protect church property and the possessions of the poor from the ravages of war. Both the truce and the peace were to be enforced under penalty of excommunication, and it was explicitly declared that no Christian should kill another, for he who kills a Christian spills the blood of Christ. In practice, peace movements often fall short of their lofty ideals, and the efforts of the 11th century were no exception. Many princes who had vocally supported the Truce of God disregarded its rules. William the Conqueror, for example, fought against his fellow Christian, Harold, at Hastings on a Saturday. Anna Comnena would later express her horror that while her own church sincerely sought to avoid conflict on holy days, Western knights dared to attack Constantinople during Holy Week, their armies even including armed and combat-ready priests. The popes, too, were well aware that church land remained vulnerable to attacks by lay rulers. The West's love of battle and its admiration for military glory could not easily be subdued. It seemed more practical to return to earlier policies, channeling this restless energy into wars against non-Christians. For the Western realms, the Muslim threat appeared far more severe than it had to the Byzantines, at least before the Turkish invasions. To the Byzantines, the Turks were alarming primarily as barbarians, rather than as infidels. Since the failure of the Arab siege of Constantinople in the early 8th century, warfare along the eastern frontier of Christendom had been frequent, but not seriously threatening to the empire's stability, nor did it significantly disrupt commercial or intellectual exchanges. Arabs, like Byzantines, were inheritors of Greco-Roman civilization, and their lifestyles were not so dissimilar. A Byzantine would often feel more at home in Cairo or Baghdad than in Paris, Goslar, or even Rome. Except during rare crises or retaliatory periods, the authorities of both the empire and the caliphate generally refrained from forced conversions and allowed freedom of worship. Although boastful caliphs might sometimes belittle the Christian emperors or demand tribute, the Byzantines, as demonstrated in the late 10th century, remained a powerful and highly organized adversary. The Western Christian did not share the Byzantines' tolerance or sense of security. He took pride in being a Christian and considered himself the successor to Rome, yet he was uncomfortably aware that, in many ways, Muslim civilization surpassed his own. Muslim power dominated the Western Mediterranean, stretching from Catalonia to Tunis. Muslim pirates targeted Christian shipping, and Rome itself had been sacked by Muslim forces. They had constructed fortresses in Italy and Provence, and from their strongholds in Spain, it seemed possible that they might again cross the frontiers and sweep over the Pyrenees into France. Western Christendom lacked the organization necessary to repel such an invasion. Since the time of Charles Martel, individual leaders had successfully repelled Saracen raids, and for a period, the Carolingian Empire had provided a stable defense. In 915, Pope John X, working alongside the court of Constantinople, organized an alliance of Christian rulers to expel the Muslims from their stronghold on the Garigliano River. In 941, the Byzantines joined forces with Hugh of Provence in an assault on their fortress at Frejus. This effort failed due to Hugh's sudden change of mind. However, in 972, a coalition of Provençal and Italian princes finally succeeded in destroying the Muslim presence there. These alliances, however, were isolated, sporadic, and short-lived. There was a pressing need for more extensive coordination and a sustained campaign. Meanwhile, the monastery of Cluny began to take a growing interest in Spanish affairs. Abbot Odilo, who died in 1048, and his successor Hugh, who led until 1109, devoted special attention to Spain. Cluny had long been concerned with the well-being of pilgrims and welcomed any opportunity to oversee the pilgrimage routes to Compostela and contribute to the defense of Spanish Christendom. It was likely through Cluniac influence that Roger of Tosny, driven partly by Norman ambition, came from Normandy to assist Countess Erskine of Barcelona in 1018 when Muslim forces threatened her lands. Under Sancho and his successors, Cluny's influence over the Spanish church expanded, drawing it into the broader movement for reform. The papacy naturally regarded any efforts to expand Christian territory in Spain with particular favor. Cluniac and papal support accompanied Sancho William of Gascony when he allied with Sancho of Navarre in an offensive against the Emir of Saragossa. They likewise encouraged Raymond Berenguer I of Barcelona as he advanced southward, pushing Muslim forces back and extending Christian control. The war against the infidels in Spain gradually took on the character of a holy war, and soon the popes themselves became directly involved in its leadership. In 1063, as King Ramiro I of Aragon was launching a major offensive against the Muslims, he was assassinated by a Muslim at Grados. His death captured the imagination of Christian Europe. Pope Alexander II immediately offered indulgences to all who fought for the cross in Spain and began organizing an army to continue Ramiro's campaign. William of Montreuil, a Norman soldier in the Pope's service, gathered troops in northern Italy. In northern France, Count Eblis of Russie, brother to Queen Felicia of Aragon, raised another force, while the largest contingent was led by Guy Geoffrey, Count of Aquitaine, who assumed command of the expedition. Despite these efforts, little progress was made. The town of Barbastro was taken and a great deal of booty secured, but it was soon lost again. Nevertheless, French knights continued to cross the Pyrenees to join the struggle. In 1073, Eblis of Russie organized a new expedition. Pope Gregory VII called on Christian princes to take part, asserting that the Spanish kingdom was under the authority of St. Peter's See and declaring that Christian knights were entitled to keep the lands they seized from the infidels. In 1078, Hugh I, Duke of Burgundy, led an army to assist his brother-in-law, Alfonso VI of Castile. 2 years later, Gregory VII personally endorsed another expedition under the leadership of Guy Geoffrey. For a time, Christian forces made significant gains. The Castilians captured Toledo in 1085. However, a Muslim resurgence followed, led by the fervent Almoravids. From 1087 onward, Christian knights were urgently summoned to Spain to resist this renewed threat. Pope Urban II offered his full support, even advising pilgrims who had intended to journey to Palestine to instead spend their resources rebuilding Spanish towns reclaimed from Muslim control. Throughout the remainder of the century, these Spanish campaigns continued to attract adventurous knights from northern Europe, culminating in the capture of Huesca in 1096 and Barbastro once more in 1101, bringing this phase of the conflict to a close. By the end of the 11th century, the concept of holy war had become a reality. Christian knights and soldiers were urged by the Church to abandon their internal conflicts and travel to the frontiers of Christendom to fight the infidel. In return, they were allowed to claim the lands they liberated and were granted spiritual rewards. The exact nature of these spiritual benefits remains somewhat unclear. Alexander II appears to have offered indulgences to those who joined the 1064 campaign, while Gregory VII promised absolution to those who died fighting for the cross. He had previously offered similar absolution to the soldiers of Rudolph of Swabia, who battled against the excommunicated Henry IV of Germany. The papacy was increasingly assuming leadership over these holy wars. Although many of the great princes tended to keep their distance, Western knights eagerly answered the call to the holy war. Their motivations were partly rooted in sincere religious conviction. They were ashamed of their constant internal conflicts and longed to fight instead for the cross. Yet, there was also a strong desire for land, particularly in northern France, where the system of primogeniture was becoming increasingly common. As lords became more reluctant to divide their estates, and the offices associated with them younger sons were forced to seek their fortunes elsewhere. A spirit of restlessness and adventure permeated the knightly class in France, especially among the Normans, who were only a few generations removed from their freebooting ancestors. The prospect of fulfilling one's Christian duty while also acquiring land in a southern climate held great appeal. The Church, observing the enthusiasm and progress of the movement, found cause for satisfaction. Might not this same approach be applied to the eastern frontier of Christendom as well?